All right. 2 videos in one day and an essay. You guys can probably tell I'm just failing school from how much time I am pumping out work for not related to school, things that I'm not doing. Anyways, I feel like I got to talk about this topic because I can't let this topic go. I cannot let this topic slide because I feel like it's such a huge, huge issue. Um, and I think even in philosophy, we possibly make this mistake too. Maybe. I don't know if I'm willing to die in that hill, but I have a hunch. Um, so let me frame this question. When we think about a problem, are we thinking about a problem or are we thinking about a solution? Um, Typically, we think we are thinking about the problem. Typically. But most times, we're actually thinking about the solution and not the problem. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about how naturally we do not really think about the problem. That means that we assume we know what the problem is, right? So for example, I'm going to play with this example right here. What is a solution? What is a solution? Okay, let's just think that through. What is a solution? Okay. Hmm. A solution is let's just throw a dart on a board here. A solution is a answer. A solution is an answer to a problem, right? Let's just give it that basic broad definition. A solution is an answer to a problem. Okay, let's think about this a little bit more. How do we come up with the criteria for the solution? See, see, I'm already kind of like struggling to answer this because most of the time we don't think through the problem. We assume the problem and then think the solution. So that's the difference, is like we need to think the problem rather than think the solution. But let's continue. Let's just play with this fake game that I'm doing. So, okay, so what's a solution? I said a solution is an answer to a problem. Okay, so how do we determine a proper answer to the problem? Well, typically we have to come up with some type of criteria to which we give and satisfy said solution. Well, how what gives the criteria for a solution? Well, the criteria, here's the funny thing. The criteria cannot be self-constructed. The criteria is immanent in the problem. That means you have to think the problem in order to discover the criteria for said solution. But I really, really hate this word. I extremely hate solution because it has like a kind of like finality to it. Like, oh, I solved it. Um, and I still struggle. And I'm so happy my friend Dawood commented because he also says how he hates, he hates the word solution because it immediately makes you think that you can just solve this thing, that you can just give a solution. So what I'm trying to say is that in order for you to have a solution, you can't assume the problem. You have to think the problem. And by virtue of thinking the problem, the solution arises of its own accord, right? So that means there is no thinking the solution. The solution, in my opinion, we can disagree. I am totally welcoming disagreements on this part because I'm thoroughly interested in this problem. Okay. But we have to think about how thinking the problem structures the solution. It shouldn't be the other way. It shouldn't be the other way around. We shouldn't structure the solution to solve the problem. We should think the problem to structure the solution. But for some reason, we have it like backwards. We have it like, I know what the problem is, so now I'm going to think about how to solve it. And so we're thinking about how to solve it. But like I said before, if you're trying to think a problem, you can't. If you're trying to think a solution, I'm going to take that back. If you're trying to think a solution, you can't think. I've just lost my train of thought. If you're trying to think a solution, you're failing to think the problem. You're assuming that you know the problem. So you really need to understand the structure of the problem before we even talk about the solution. Before we even dare think about the stupid solution. Because I can't tell you how much I hate that word. And I am begging somebody to please give me another word. Like I don't like any of the substitutes that we've come up with, like Dawood, he gave me a couple, like wrestle, grapple, and I just don't like it. I guess I'd rather say maybe instead of solution, we can come up with like a response is needed for the problem. We don't even say solution. So response. We need a response to the problem. Okay. And what's funny about this is that if we take away the term solution and we say, okay, why do we want a solution? We want a solution because ultimately we have no response to the problem, right? So a solution is a response. But solution itself is such a tainted word because it gives us the impression of, again, like I said before, a kind of finality to our thinking. Okay. But what's funny about this is that is not thinking the problem a response to the problem? So that means thinking the problem is a response to the problem. And that means that if we're going to have an answer to the problem, we have to thoroughly think through the problem. And it's not just think, it's a thinking. It is a continuous action of thinking the problem. Okay, got that off my chest. I got that off my chest because I was really thinking about this issue because I was like, you know what? There's something that doesn't make any sense. We typically jump the gun. And this is a very common anecdote, but I think it's important to kind of give an example like what I'm talking about here. Because even though I think maybe those of you that watch me daily or often, a lot of you understand where I'm coming from. But those of you that don't, don't know where I'm coming from on this. All I can say is I do have an anecdote to kind of explain what I'm talking about. So, and I have a personal one. I've shared this with already the public, but I'll share it again. So, one of the biggest problems in my life was the absence of my father, right? The sort of lack thereof. Um, so, if we want to entertain what I am saying, um, instead of a solution, what does thinking the problem of this actually look like? Thinking the thinking this problem is something like this, right? As a child, I grew up with a lack of a father. Okay. So here's the question. If father is the problem, what is a father? Right? Let's think that through. What is a father? Okay. So a father, let's just, you know, give I'm gonna just give like probably the most mundane, easy answers, probably like what a child would think. What is a father? So like what is a father? Father is um someone who uh you know uh, disciplines you, right? You're gonna see how funny this is. A father is somebody who takes care of you, plays with you, gives you advice, shows you um, manly things, whatever that is. And yeah, okay. Let's just stick with that horrible definition, because I'm gonna make a point here pretty soon. Okay. Next question: does a father have to be a biological father? Right. The very concept of father doesn't necessarily have to be biological in nature, right? If we grant this assumption, right, that there can be father figures, like, and fathers, um, in our society today, we definitely have this conception of like, he's just my biological parent, he's not my father, right? So let's just think about this phenomenological experience of culture and this problem of father, because this is actually a very common statement, right? Like, oh no, that's not my dad. That's just like my biological parent. My real dad is blah 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 blah. Right? This is a very common thing that is in our culture. Okay, so I'm just playing with this assumption. So if this is true, then obviously the concept of father cannot be tied to is not strictly tied to biological parent, right? It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And I think society is proof of that. It doesn't have to be. We have many understandings of like, this is the father that adopted me, or somebody decides to reject their biological father and call this other male figure their father. So, but here's the thing about that. What what calls for that movement, like, how does a subject know what father is and what father isn't, right? And this is this is really interesting because, remember, I didn't really grow up with a father, so this concept is like alien to me, and yet I have some idea of what father means. You know what I mean? Like, I have some idea of what father means. So if we think through this problem more thoroughly, I don't I don't have a good explanation of what father is. All I know is, right, from my childhood, is that this person that I label as my father, right, isn't there. and yet I have no concept of what father is because I didn't have one really, you know? But it's this thing where it's this really interesting issue where it's like, so what am I upset about as a child? Like what is it that is so visceral and so reactionary to my experience that I'm, as a child, I am frustrated and upset that my father isn't there, right? And yet I really don't have an understanding of father. All I have is, if I'm being honest about my actual childhood here, the only concept of father that I really had was just like male presence, like a kind of male presence, right? Um, so the reason why I am doing this kind of long detour on going through like what is a father is that by thinking through this problem and even if my questions are poor, right, we're already getting like a kind of hint of like I don't really know what father is, right? I don't know what criteria I'm holding him to. The only criteria that I'm holding him to, it seems, at least in my experience, is that his lack of mere presence, his lack of presence, right? So how do I deal? This would be the next problem. How does one deal with the lack of presence? And then yet here's the irony, right? As I got older, my father started showing up more. So then we come across a really interesting issue where it's like, okay, so if I'm upset as a child about the lack of presence, and I have no concept of father other than the lack of presence, then my understanding of father is literally just lack of presence. At least, I mean, because honestly, as a child, that this is literally all I understand is lack of presence. Okay. But then my father shows up. Okay. And then as a child, I am upset over my father being there, but then I'm upset about the lack of presence, right? Okay, so let's think about this. So if my father is now showing up, but as a child you're upset because of the lack of presence that he missed, that he wasn't there for, the real question is how do you deal with this issue, right? How do you grapple with this issue? Well, you see, that question, that how do you deal with that, is already a little bit like that question is very dangerous because already you're sort of catering to how do I think the solution. Let's not think the solution. Not yet. Let's, in fact, remember, I'm trying to avoid thinking the solution. So let's go back. Let's think again. Let's think this through. So far, my understanding of father is lack of presence. But then there's this other issue. My father is there. So what's going on here? Right? Lack of presence, but now my father's there. Lack of presence, but now my father's there. You see what is happening, and then yet my father is there, and then yet I am holding a kind of grudge against him for his lack of presence, even though he's there. So what is it that I want? right? What is it that I want out of this? Well, immediately, just asking this question is actually extremely reflective, actually. Like, what is that you want out of this, right? Well, you have several responses. If we look at the descriptive situation, my father is showing up now, right? And this is true for my life. Like, my dad started showing up more, like, I think right when I graduated high school. Okay, so my dad's showing up more now, but I held resentment for the lack of presence, right? But he's showing up now. So the question that we are led to ask is, what do I want from this? Why am I still holding on? Like, what do I want? What do I want him to acknowledge that I'm so upset about? Okay. And so let's play this out further, right? So you're holding resentment, and then you have a grudge against your father, but then your father's there. How do we think through this problem? What is the next step for this problem? Because it seems like we're at a standstill here. And so we're left with a couple of options, right? Not solutions, but we're left with a couple of options. Either I continue to be upset and resentful over the fact that my father was not there, but now he is here, or I face, or I have to face the fact that he's there when in the past he wasn't, right? So now we're talking about time. Now we're talking about how to think through this presence of my father being there when he's not there. Okay. So now that I feel like now that we've kind of like asked enough questions about the problem, and that my concept of father was through a lack of presence, right? Wouldn't it be a better idea? Because again, this is my understanding of father as a child, the lack of father, the lack of presence, but then my father is here now. Wouldn't I want to give him a chance so I can discover what father means, because now he's here? You know what I mean? Because again, the only concept that I had as a child is the lack of presence, but then my dad's here. So isn't this an opportunity to figure out and discover what this concept actually means? And what's ironic about this is that we can take the lack of father as a kind of like a new grounding, because what ends up happening is that now that my father shows up, I don't have a concept of father. But I had kept approaching him as a concept of father. But my concept of father already negated the idea of father. So that means that the adequate approach is to actually look at my father as not father. Is to actually look at him like, I never really knew this man. And so I need to get to know him. And so just like the way you understand the concept of father that lacks, that doesn't exist, you can remedy that concept of father by allowing the concept of father to emerge, because now the individual that you so heavily burdened the identity of father with can now emerge through this meeting. And I know that was very confusing. Um, I wish that I could. I'll probably have to write this down, but for those of you that understood, I am so happy you did. But again, this was mainly a long anecdote just to show that we need to think through the problem and how the problem contains within itself imminently the solution. So because the problem already contains within itself the solution, the response, we don't need to think the solution, because thinking the solution is assuming that you know the problem, right? So we need to not know that we need to we need to assume that we don't know the problem. Like, we need to first understand the structure of the problem. And so the reason why I gave that anecdote is because if you go through the structure of the problem, you quickly understood that my concept of father, I had none. I had no concept of father. The only concept of father that I had was lack of presence. And so I immediately met my own contradiction when my father showed up, and it's like he's there, but then he's not there because that's the concept of father that I have. Right? But that concept of father never really existed because, again, it's an empty concept, it's a lack of. Um, so basically, you understand that your concept of father was just a placeholder. But then now your father is actually here. So the best thing to actually do is to meet your father. Allow a concept of father to emerge because your concept of father was lacking. It did not have any concept. There was no understanding. Um, and you see, like, and this is actually how I, ironically, this is actually how I kind of got over some of my like resentment and everything with my father, because I realized like I'm holding this identity against him, as if he knows what it is and as if I know what it is. And so I dropped it. I just dropped that, you know, I dropped that burden, and I said, I'm going to just meet him as a person, you know? But what's funny is that most of the time we forget that our father is also a person. Like, there was a point in time when he wasn't a father. And what I'm trying to say is that if your father ever does come back, right, and you've only ever known a lack of, you shouldn't meet him holding the notion of father against him. You should let that notion emerge from the meeting, like getting to know your father. That should be a part of building up the notion of what father is. Now, the thing what's funny about this is that I quickly understood that, like, my father, again, isn't really a father. How did I come to that conclusion? Well, I came to that conclusion because I started realizing that, well, my father has, like, you know, well, he's he's sick, so it's hard to give like a total generalizing value judgment, but basically, like, once I started getting to know my father more, I started realizing, like, he's not a man that likes to stay with commitments. He doesn't like commitments, like, at all, you know. And for me, like, once I discovered that, like, in the most purest fashion, like, it actually made sense why he struggled to become a father, basically. Um, so by me allowing that kind of meeting, like, getting to actually genuinely know my father, and also kind of like not pitting this against him, you know. But it's like it was weird because it was like a kind of like cathartic release once I discovered like my father was just like, it was like this laughable moment where it's like, oh my God, like I've been hating a man that literally was incapable of being a father, basically. Like, you know, and I'm like, and then I started thinking about like, I can't hold this against him, you know? I mean, I feel like most people would be like, yeah, you should. But again, it's like, what am I going to hold him? Why am I going to hold it against him if all I've ever known is the lack of presence? And that was my concept of father. Like, in fact, actually, this is the most freeing moment for him and I, where I release him of father and, you know, but I let him, you know, take me in as son if he wants, you know. And in that way, ironically, you know, we've established a much healthier and, you know, our relationship's good now. So, but again, the main point is we need to be careful with jumping from thinking solutions, and we really need to think problems, because thinking problems is like, you know, one we assume that we're asking the right questions, you know, and of course assuming, you know, and then asking the right questions already assumes a kind of criteria for asking questions. And then, you know, what is the criteria for asking questions? Well, okay, well, that's a good problem to think through. What is the criteria for asking questions? Is there a criteria for asking questions? You know, but you see, the more that we ask questions without necessarily trying to ask questions that sort of like provoke us to think solutions, we really need to think questions that keep us focused on the problem. And just like the way I kind of began, like, okay, so what is father? What is your understanding of father? What is all that you know of father? Right? Literally the only answer I could come up with, like I said, is the lack of presence. That's for some reason that was something that I got really hung up on. Right? And I bet you if I were to ask my brother, he would be stunned. He wouldn't even know where to begin. Um, you know, and so if we keep asking these questions, you soon discover the structure of the problem. And by just discovering the structure of the problem, you basically you literally stumble upon the answer. Like the solution becomes the byproduct of the structure of the problem. So it becomes more important to actually think the problem than to think the solution, because think the solution is, again, assuming that you know the problem, and we cannot assume that we know the problem, right? The only problem I knew was my father was gone. Okay, so what's problematic about that? He's not here. Okay, you know, what is it about this not here that's upsetting? What is it about this not here that you feel is an obligation? Okay, um, you know, and so far that you can see how that those very answers already structure some type of, like, already structure the problem some type of way, right? That means the concept of father implies some obligation, so, you know, some obligation to be there, right? But then you, as you try to discover like more about what father's supposed to do, it gets even more murky than that. You know, it gets really murky. And it seems like a lot of the issues around, around like missing fathers is actually the lack of presence, really. The lack of presence. You know, even if you do have a physical father there, if he's always working, it's again the lack of presence. And it's the fact that we want a presence there. But the real question is, why do we want a presence there? What is it about this presence that bothers us? What is it about this presence that gives us anxiety? What is it about this presence or this lack of presence that builds resentment? What is it about this stuff? And these are the questions that are worth asking, because if we attempt to keep asking more and more, you can start seeing how you start building up the structure of the problem. And, you know, you start realizing, like, oh, like, okay, so what's resentment? Like, what is this? Like, and you start understanding something about this problem. But yeah, hopefully I made myself clear. I hope I did. But yeah, all right, I gotta go to bed. All right, guys, take care.